Hi everyone, welcome to Bonnie Carolee Makes Cards. Today's card features a gorgeous image called Lotus by Syberia Design. This watercolor card focuses on enhancing depth and dimension by using a few simple techniques. I printed this digital image 2 times on Canson XL watercolor paper. This first panel is going to be used to create the background. Clean water is applied to both the front of the panel and the back. Wetting both sides of the panel helps it to lay flat against the surface, and as it dries there will be minimal warping. On the front of the panel, I basically just wet the areas around the flowers. Not that it really matters, as you will see. I'm going to be using a color wash, so I just drop in some nice greens and turquoises into my background. I want the background to be soft, but I still have to build up the color. The color wash is applied 3 times, making sure that I dry the panel completely between applications. For each color wash, I begin by applying clean water to the panel and then dropping in color. Before painting the flower stems with Van Dyke green, I wait for the panel to dry. It is easy to test for dryness. Lightly touch the panel. If it is cool, there is moisture. If it is room temperature, it is dry. I remember when I first learned this trick and how surprised I was at how obvious it was when there was still moisture left in that panel. There's only one way that I know of stopping watercolor from bleeding, and that's making sure that the area next to it is dry. So again, I have to wait for everything to dry before I'm going to apply a watered down white gouache highlight around the floral image. Even though cutout flowers will be applied to the panel to really create a lot of dimension, the highlight accentuates that depth. When I'm finished, a damp brush is used just to blend the edge of that highlight with the background. Again, I dry before I proceed to the next step. Next, I'm going to be using a fan brush and the gouache to apply a dry brush technique. Both the brush and the paper are dry as the paint is swept across the panel in one direction and then in the other. The cross-hatching provides some additional visual interest for the background. For the final step, I place it in a protective box so that I can spatter it with watered down gouache. I'm using my smallest paintbrush so it produces a fine spatter. The speckling from the gouache is dimensional and leaves a pretty effect. That completes the background, and now I'll move on to the second set of images that I printed. The flowers will be painted using a wet on wet technique. I work at one petal at a time and begin by applying a thin layer of water. Peacock blue will be used in the shadow areas, followed by the green-blue watercolor mix. I make sure that when I move on to the next petal that it is not adjacent to any of the petals that are wet. The sepals on the flower bud are painted with a combination of Van Dyke green and the color wash. I continue to skip around the images, painting only those petals that are next to dry areas. By the time I've done that, the petals that I painted initially are dry and I can start filling in. So this is when you can see the flowers starting to really come together. The shadow and light on each of the individual petals creates depth and dimension. When working in my shadow areas, I'm pulling my peacock blue directly from the pan with just a little bit of water to maintain the intensity of that color. The turquoise color wash is introduced right next to it and blended. As I draw it up to the top of the petal, I fade it out with some water. center of the flowers are done with yellow and some yellow gold. After the images are completely dry, I fussy cut them. The outline of these images is smooth, making it easy to cut them out. Because the two flowers are joined together, I've trimmed it out as if it was one image. The background, flowers, and the flower bud are mounted on white sheet foam. When adhering anything to foam, it can take a little while to dry. The panel has a little bit of warping around the edges, so I set it aside with something heavy on it while it dries. When the glue is applied to the flowers and the flower bud, I avoid the area near the base of those elements. After everything is completely dry, I can start trimming away the excess foam. As I'm trimming, I'm coming at it at a slight angle so it undercuts the image. The foam is trimmed higher at the base of both the flower petals and the bud. After the elements are trimmed, I just use my fingers to shape them a little bit near the base. This will make it easier to adhere the part without the foam directly to the panel so that it looks like the flower is sweeping upwards. After the excess foam is trimmed from the panel, it's time to start pulling this card together. This panel is adhered to an A2 size top folding card base. I always use something sturdy. Nina Classic Crest 110 pound cardstock does the job. Before the glue is applied to the flowers, I do some additional shaping, just bending the base that does not have the foam forward a little bit. So now to have those flowers layered on, I start by putting a little bit of glue at the base and then on the foam, and I do need to hold it for a couple of minutes until that glue sets up. And so now for the double flower. Again, glue goes at the base where there is no foam and then on the foam itself, and I probably could have used an extra hand to hold everything in place, but I managed. The differing levels of elevation from the base of the flower to the top just helps that flower flow from the stem more realistically. Simon Says Stamps Big Hugs was die cut from both white cardstock and sheet foam. The foam die cut is left intact in its background, only removing the centers of the letters. After a thin layer of glue is applied to the foam, the cardstock sentiment is stacked on top. There is an impression left on the foam die cut which makes it easy to align the cardstock one on top. Using a craft pick in the letter cutouts helps make any final adjustments that are needed. The cardstock die cut could slip on the foam, so it is set aside to dry for a few minutes before the excess foam is removed. When the glue is dry, the sentiment is easily removed from the foam backing and adhered to the card. Some clear confetti are placed around the flower and topped with white Nouveau drops. The confetti in this case is used just as a foundation for the drops. It will help it maintain its high dome shape and prevent it from flattening out. I do add in a few pieces of colored confetti though, which I will top with Nouveau Crystal Drops Morning Dew. The Morning Dew dries clear, leaving a beautiful jewel-like appearance. And that wraps up this card featuring Alex Syberia Designs Lotus. I love adding depth and dimension to my cards. It can be as easy as using dimensionals or highlighting the image. Using shadow and light is a little bit more advanced, but develops through practice. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, I appreciate your visit.